the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates, life was supposed to be simple and serene. Rows of well-maintained houses, manicured lawns, and trimmed hedges created a picture-perfect scene. Enforced by the ever-watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association, the HOA was known for its strict rules designed to maintain the neighborhood's pristine appearance and property values. Residents dutifully followed regulations, attending monthly meetings and resolving minor disputes with an air of civility. But beneath the polished surface, tension sometimes simmered quietly, waiting for a spark to ignite them. That spark came one sunny afternoon when Claire Hastings, a relatively new resident with a young family, decided to build a privacy fence around her backyard. It was not a grand gesture, just a simple 6-foot wooden fence intended to give her children a safe play area and shield them from the neighbors' prying eyes. What Claire didn't do, however, was seek prior approval from the HOA Architectural Committee, a critical step according to the community's bylaws. She figured it would be a routine matter, no big deal. Word of Claire's fence spread quickly. To some, it was a welcome addition finally, a little privacy from the constant gaze of nosy neighbors. To others, it was an affront to the neighborhood's uniform aesthetic, a breach of the unspoken social contract everyone had tacitly agreed to uphold. The fence was a tall, solid barrier, stained a dark brown that starkly contrasted with the neutral pastel colors favored by the HOA. It blocked sunlight from reaching the neighboring garden, cast long shadows over adjacent yards, and, perhaps most importantly, it was built without permission. The HOA board was immediately alerted. Minutes after the first complaints, an official notice was sent to Claire, informing her that the fence violated community rules and needed to be removed or altered. Claire, feeling blindsided and unfairly targeted, argued that her fence was within reasonable bounds and that the HOA was being overly rigid. The board, led by President Margaret Wilkins, a woman known for her unwavering adherence to the rules and little tolerance for exceptions, stood firm. This was the beginning of the fence fiasco. As the dispute escalated, neighbors took sides. Some viewed Claire as a victim of an overbearing HOA. Others saw her as a rebel disrupting the harmony of their shared space. In meetings, the tone shifted from polite discussion to heated arguments. Alliances formed quickly, old friends became foes, and quiet neighbors found their voices in support or condemnation. At the heart of the tension was not just the fence itself, but what it represented. For many, the fence symbolized control and autonomy versus conformity and collective authority. Claire's act was seen as a challenge to the established order. For others, it was an opportunity to settle long-standing grudges masked by neighborly smiles. The fence became a battleground, a physical and symbolic barrier dividing the community. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated of secret meetings and covert plans. Some residents plotted ways to force Claire's compliance, while others considered countermeasures to protect her interests. The once friendly neighborhood was fracturing, and the HOA's ability to maintain order was slipping through its fingers. What started as a simple construction project had now planted the seed of discord, threatening to unravel the social fabric of Maplewood Estates. As tensions rose, it was clear that this fence was more than just wood and nails. It was the catalyst for a much larger, more personal war. And with tempers flaring and old wounds reopening, nobody could predict just how far the fence fiasco would go. The fence Claire Hastings built was more than just wood. Nailed together, it became the epicenter of a conflict that would fracture Maplewood Estates. Like no dispute before, the morning after the fence went up, the neighborhood awoke to a new reality. A tangible line had been drawn, and the consequences rippled through the community with force. At first, neighbors gawked openly, whispering behind curtains, exchanging tense looks across sidewalks. What many thought would be a simple matter resolved in a week spiraled into something much bigger. The fence was unapproved, that much was clear. But it wasn't just about the fence itself, it was what the fence represented. Privacy, control, autonomy, and for some, outright rebellion. Margaret Wilkins, the HOA president, wasted no time. She had built her reputation on keeping Maplewood Estates picture perfect, enforcing rules without exception, maintaining an image that the neighborhood was one of discipline and order. For Margaret, Claire's fence was a threat not just to the aesthetics, but to the entire system she guarded fiercely. It was a breach of protocol, an insult to the governance she led. The whole board convened an emergency meeting just days after the fence went up. Margaret's voice was firm as she laid out the violation and the necessary steps to rectify it. The board members nodded in unison. This was a precedent that could not stand. Yet, beyond the boardroom walls, the neighborhood was already cracking. Word traveled fast in Maplewood Estates, and residents found themselves forced to take sides, many for reasons deeper than just the fence. Among the traditionalists, frustration and fear mingled. They feared that if Claire got away with breaking the rules, others would follow. Trees might be planted too tall, paint colors might stray from the palette, and fences might sprout without oversight. This loss of control was unacceptable. Their support for Margaret and the HOA's actions was resolute. On the other side were those who saw Claire's fence as a justified assertion of her rights. Some sympathized because they themselves had felt stifled by the HOA's heavy-handedness. They perceived the rules as archaic, suffocating the personal freedoms that owning a home should grant. For these residents, Claire was a hero of sorts, someone willing to challenge a system that had long felt like a cage. As these opposing camps solidified, the lines between neighborly civility and rivalry began to blur. The friendly smiles exchanged during morning jogs became strained nods. Garden fences that once hosted shared flowers now cast long, forbidding shadows. The tension was palpable, a silent undercurrent flowing beneath the surface of every interaction. The fence became a lightning rod, drawing out grievances that had been simmering for years. Old disputes over parking spaces, landscaping choices, and noise complaints suddenly resurfaced with renewed bitterness. Neighbors who had long tolerated one another quietly found their patience exhausted. Behind the scenes, alliances formed with a strategic and almost conspiratorial air. Margaret rallied the HOA board and a group of loyal residents who were committed to enforcing the rules no matter the cost. They coordinated plans for increased patrols and inspections, hoping to find any other violations by Claire or her supporters. Their goal was clear: pressure until the fence came down. Meanwhile, Claire found herself unexpectedly surrounded by a coalition of sympathizers. Neighbors who had felt marginalized by the board's rigidity saw her as a symbol of defiance. They exchanged hushed messages, sharing stories of their own struggles with the HOA's stringent codes. Some were prepared to back Claire legally, while others offered practical support: extra eyes to watch the fence at night, friendly visits to check on her property, or advice on how to withstand HOA pressures. But this was not a civil political debate, it was a turf war. Small acts of sabotage began to surface. Claire's garden gnome went missing one morning, replaced by a crudely painted sign. That read "Fence Outlaw." A set of tire tracks appeared suspiciously close to her flower beds. Crushing delicate plants, she found notes slipped under her door, anonymous accusations and veiled threats. The HOA supporters, for their part, did not claim responsibility, but their own properties suffered petty acts of retaliation. Mailboxes were vandalized, garden hoses were cut, and car tires mysteriously deflated. The neighborhood was becoming a powder keg, ready to explode. Social media amplified the drama. The private Facebook group for Maplewood Estates, once a place for sharing recommendations and local news, turned toxic. Threads erupted in insults, accusations, and conspiracy theories. Screenshots of inflammatory comments leaked to residents who had no access to the group. Fueling further mistrust, the digital battlefields were just as fierce as the real ones. Through it all, the HOA's official stance remained unyielding. Letters piled up in Claire's mailbox, each more threatening than the last. Fines were imposed, deadlines set, and legal counsel mentioned. The message was clear: remove the fence or face escalating consequences. Claire, feeling increasingly isolated but resolute, refused to back down. To her, The fence was a sanctuary, a safe haven for her family, and a boundary against intrusive neighbors. And bureaucracy alike, she was prepared to fight, not just for her fence, but for her right to self-determination. As the dispute festered, other neighbors found themselves caught in the crossfire. Those who tried to remain neutral were pressured from both sides, suspected of disloyalty, and occasionally targeted with gossip or subtle exclusion. The sense of community that had once defined Maplewood Estates was slipping away. The tension seeped into every aspect of daily life. Lawn parties were canceled. The neighborhood book club disbanded. The annual block barbecue, once the highlight of summer, was quietly shelved amid fears of confrontation. This was no longer a simple fence dispute. It was a war of wills, a battle over identity, authority, and the very soul of the neighborhood. As the physical barrier stood firm, so did the ideological divide grow wider and deeper. With trust eroded and tempers flaring, Maplewood Estates teetered on the edge of chaos. What had begun as a straightforward HOA violation was now an entrenched conflict, pulling every resident into its orbit. No one could say where it would end or what sacrifices the neighborhood might have to make to restore peace. By the time Chapter 3 unfolds, Maplewood Estates was no longer the peaceful suburb it once appeared to be. The quiet neighborhood had transformed into a simmering battleground, where personal grudges mingled with official grievances, and the once cordial ties between neighbors now hung by frayed threads. Claire Hastings' fence was the flashpoint, but beneath it lay years of unspoken resentments, territorial disputes, and power struggles. The situation had escalated far beyond the original issue of an unapproved privacy fence. It had become a proxy war over control, respect, and what it meant to live in a community governed by rules. The HOA, under Margaret Wilkins' iron-fisted leadership, had shifted from mere rule enforcement to aggressive confrontation. Armed with a legal team and an arsenal of letters and fines, the board began wielding its authority like a weapon. Notices piled up in Claire's mailbox, each more insistent than the last. The board threatened to impose daily fines that would quickly escalate to thousands of dollars, and even hinted at legal action to force removal of the fence. The message was unmistakable. The HOA intended to crush any defiance. On the other side, Claire refused to back down. Her fence was more than a structure, it was her statement of autonomy, a stand against what she perceived as an overbearing, micromanaging authority. Supported by a growing faction of neighbors who questioned the HOA's rigid rules, Claire sought legal advice and prepared to fight the battle on her own terms. Her supporters organized, sharing resources, pooling funds, and recruiting allies from beyond the neighborhood. With both sides entrenched, the battle lines of Maplewood Estates were unmistakable. The neighborhood was now sharply divided, those loyal to the HOA and those backing Claire. Even longtime friendships fractured under the strain, as neighbors chose sides in a conflict that had become intensely personal. The physical divide the fence represented was mirrored by social and psychological walls. Block parties that once united the street were canceled indefinitely. Invitations to casual gatherings ceased. Residents began avoiding one another, walking with heads down or exchanging only curt nods. The sense of community that had defined Maplewood Estates was crumbling. Petty acts of retaliation became the new norm. Claire's lawn was repeatedly sabotaged, flower beds trampled overnight, her mailbox smeared with paint, security cameras vandalized. Anonymous notes with threats and insults were left on her doorstep. The HOA supporters, for their part, were not immune from attacks. Their cars were keyed, mailboxes damaged, and personal property defaced. The conflict had turned toxic, with neither side willing to concede. Even the neighborhood's social media became a war zone. Heated debates erupted online, with residents trading accusations and insults. Screenshots of inflammatory posts circulated, and moderators struggled to contain the chaos. The digital community that once served as a forum for neighborly support was now a tool for division and hostility. Margaret Wilkins, steadfast in her resolve, pushed the HOA board to escalate enforcement actions. She arranged for official inspections to scour Claire's property for any additional infractions. Minor complaints about trash bins or lawn maintenance were weaponized to add pressure. Every perceived violation was documented and reported, all part of a deliberate strategy to wear Claire down. Claire's camp, in turn, prepared for legal resistance. They consulted attorneys and community advocates, readying challenges to the HOA's authority. Some supporters even proposed organizing a recall effort to remove Margaret and other hardline board members at the next election. What began as a fence dispute was now a movement against what many saw as an authoritarian HOA leadership. The broader community watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Neighbors from adjacent streets whispered about Maplewood Estates, warning their own communities of the dangers of unchecked HOA power and, conversely, of lawless neighbors undermining community standards. The neighborhood's reputation suffered, with prospective buyers steering clear, wary of becoming part of a neighborhood at war. Yet amid the chaos, a few brave residents sought to mediate. They attempted to open channels of communication, hoping to bridge the widening gap. But with wounds so fresh and emotions so raw, their efforts met with little success. Suspicion and anger overshadowed reason. As summer gave way to fall, the standoff showed no sign of abating. The fence stood tall and unyielding, just as the resolve of both sides hardened. The HOA board scheduled a public hearing, promising to enforce penalties and consider legal actions. Claire's supporters planned a community meeting to discuss their next moves, including fundraising for potential lawsuits. The stakes had never been higher. What started as a simple, unapproved fence had spiraled into a full-blown neighborhood war, one that threatened not just property values and aesthetics, but the very fabric of what it meant to live in Maplewood Estates. No one could foresee the consequences that would soon unfold. But one thing was clear: the battle lines were firmly drawn, and neither side intended to retreat. By the time the conflict in Maplewood Estates reached Chapter 4, the neighborhood had descended into chaos masked by polite facades and carefully crafted smiles. The simple fence that Claire Hastings built without approval was now the battleground of a deepening war. A war fueled not only by official HOA sanctions and legal threats, but by whispered secrets, covert schemes, and acts of sabotage designed to humiliate and punish. The atmosphere was charged with suspicion and paranoia. No porch light was trusted, no backyard was free from prying eyes. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now watched from behind curtains or peered cautiously over fences, wondering who might be plotting the next move in this escalating feud. Margaret Wilkins and the HOA board, desperate to assert control, resorted to increasingly aggressive tactics. The board enlisted private investigators to monitor Claire's property, searching for any possible violations. Surveillance cameras appeared overnight on several neighboring homes, their lenses aimed squarely at Claire's fence. Flyers circulated anonymously, warning residents to protect our community and to report any suspicious activity. Behind closed doors, the HOA board plotted strategies beyond mere legal letters and fines. They considered orchestrating neighborhood petitions demanding Claire's removal, or mounting a campaign to elect new board members loyal to their cause. The battle was no longer limited to paperwork. It was now a psychological war designed to isolate Claire and wear down her defenses. Meanwhile, Claire's circle of supporters was growing bolder. They organized neighborhood patrols to deter vandalism against her property, and documented every action taken by the HOA to create a record for potential legal battles. What started as a grassroots defense had morphed into a coordinated resistance movement, complete with flyers promoting fairness and freedom and calls for HOA reform. But as public posturing escalated, the real war was waged in shadows. Secret alliances formed between neighbors, often surprising given the fractured social fabric. Friends turned informants, exchanging intelligence on who attended which meetings and who planned what next. An anonymous tip line emerged where residents could report grievances or suspicious actions, sometimes truthfully, sometimes as tools of revenge. Sabotage became the dark currency of this conflict. Claire's fence, the original spark, was repeatedly vandalized, paint slashed, boards removed in the dead of night, garden ornaments disappeared or were destroyed. Her mailbox was smashed more than once, requiring costly repairs. The psychological toll was heavy, eroding her sense of safety. In retaliation, Claire's supporters staged their own acts of defiance. HOA board members' lawns were littered with flyers exposing alleged conflicts of interest and past disputes. Garden gnomes mysteriously multiplied on certain lawns, mocking the rigid uniformity the HOA sought to enforce. The neighborhood's quiet order gave way to pranks and provocations, each side trying to outdo the other without crossing legal lines, though sometimes the boundaries blurred. Rumors swirled as well, with whispers of illegal dumping, covert meetings, and even intimidation tactics. Some neighbors claimed to have overheard plans for boycotting community events or pressuring real estate agents to avoid listing homes in Maplewood Estates. The conflict had metastasized into a full-scale social war. Despite the ugliness, some moments of reluctant cooperation occurred. When a pipe burst under the main road, flooding several yards, both sides worked together to manage the emergency. For a brief time, the fence dispute was put aside, replaced by a shared need for practical problem solving. But these moments were rare and fleeting. The neighborhood's social media group became a vortex of chaos. Posts alternated between calls for peace and vitriol-filled rants. Attempts at mediation were drowned out by accusations and name-calling. Moderators struggled to contain the storm, and some resigned, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Local news caught wind of the escalating drama, drawing unwanted attention to Maplewood Estates. Articles painted a picture of a neighborhood unraveling over a fence, of petty feuds spilling into legal threats and midnight vandalism. Some residents bristled at the negative publicity, others welcomed the spotlight, hoping it might pressure the HOA to soften its stance. The HOA board's tactics, however, began to backfire. Some longtime residents grew uneasy with the aggressive approach and quietly questioned Margaret's leadership. Meetings became fraught with tension, with members pushing back against the escalating conflict and the mounting legal expenses. Claire, though battered and weary, remained resolute. Her fence still stood, weathering each act of sabotage and each new fine. She had become a symbol not just of resistance against an overbearing HOA, but of a broader struggle between individual rights and collective control. As autumn deepened, the neighborhood braced for what many suspected would be a dramatic showdown. Plans were underway for a high-stakes public hearing, where HOA leaders would present their case for removing the fence and imposing penalties. Claire's supporters vowed to attend in force, ready to defend her right to keep the barrier. But beneath the surface, a more dangerous game was unfolding, one of secrets, schemes, and calculated sabotage that threatened to push Maplewood Estates beyond a mere property dispute and into a full-blown neighborhood war. As the days grew shorter and the chill of late autumn settled over Maplewood Estates, the simmering tensions around Claire Hastings' unauthorized privacy fence reached a boiling point. The neighborhood, already fractured by months of acrimony, was bracing for a public showdown that promised to change everything, or perhaps destroy what little remained of the community's fragile peace. The HOA board, led by Margaret Wilkins, scheduled a highly anticipated hearing to address the ongoing dispute. Flyers announcing the event were plastered on community bulletin boards and sent to every resident's mailbox, inviting neighbors to witness what Margaret framed as a necessary defense of community standards. Claire and her supporters, unwilling to concede, also rallied their forces, promising to turn the hearing into a battleground for fairness and individual rights. In the days leading up to the hearing, Maplewood Estates buzzed with anticipation and apprehension. The street, once quiet in the early evening, was alive with hushed conversations and uneasy glances. On one side, neighbors who supported the HOA's strict enforcement gathered, confident that rules were rules and that Claire's defiance could not be tolerated. On the other, a growing faction of residents who sympathized with Claire prepared to challenge the board's narrative. determined to protect what they saw as an essential right to privacy and personal property. As the hearing began, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The HOA board laid out a comprehensive case against Claire's fence, detailing every alleged violation, from the lack of prior approval to the fence's color and height. Their presentation was meticulous and uncompromising, backed by legal documents, photographs, and testimonies from several board members and neighbors. Claire's supporters countered with their own arguments, emphasizing the fence's function as a necessary privacy measure for her family. They highlighted inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement policies and argued that the board's aggressive approach had sown division and fear in the neighborhood. Some even questioned Margaret's leadership, pointing to the mounting costs and negative publicity as evidence of a failed administration. The hearing quickly devolved into a polarized confrontation. Voices rose, accusations flew, and long-standing grievances spilled out in full force. The community was laid bare, its cracks and fissures exposed for all to see. Those who had tried to remain neutral found themselves caught in the crossfire, pressured to pick sides or face social isolation. As the evening wore on, the board announced its decision. The fence must be removed within 30 days, or the HOA would initiate legal proceedings to enforce compliance. Fines would continue to accumulate until the fence was dismantled. The verdict was a crushing blow to Claire and her supporters. But the fallout extended far beyond a single property dispute. The ruling deepened the neighborhood's divide, triggering a wave of resentment and retaliation. Claire's camp vowed to resist, promising to challenge the decision in court. Meanwhile, the HOA board prepared to double down, anticipating a protracted legal battle. In the days following the hearing, Maplewood Estates was consumed by acts of vandalism and escalating tensions. Claire's fence, the symbol of the conflict, was again targeted, paint splattered, wood slashed, and surveillance cameras damaged. Supporters organized night watches and security patrols, determined to protect the fence and their stand for personal rights. On the opposite side, HOA loyalists faced similar harassment. Mailboxes were defaced, garden decorations destroyed, and personal property tampered with. The conflict, once confined to official letters and meetings, had exploded into a neighborhood-wide feud marked by fear and hostility. Social events, once a cornerstone of community bonding, were canceled or met with boycotts. The annual holiday decorations contest, a much-loved tradition, was scrapped amid threats and vandalism. Children who once played freely in the streets now stayed indoors, shielded from the toxic atmosphere. The neighborhood's reputation suffered too. Local news outlets picked up the story, portraying Maplewood Estates as a cautionary tale of how a minor HOA dispute could spiral into a social war. Realtors reported fewer inquiries, and some homeowners considered selling, eager to escape the turmoil. Amid the chaos, cracks began to appear within the HOA board itself. Some members grew uneasy with Margaret's hardline tactics, concerned about the escalating costs and the neighborhood's deteriorating social fabric. Quiet conversations hinted at possible leadership challenges and calls for a more conciliatory approach. Claire, warned but determined, continued her legal fight. The fence remained standing, a defiant monument to personal freedom amid the storm. She received support from a growing coalition, including advocacy groups and legal aid organizations, signaling that the conflict was no longer just a neighborhood squabble but part of a broader debate about HOA power and individual rights. As winter approached, the fence dispute showed no signs of abating. The neighborhood stood divided, scarred by months of conflict and betrayal. Trust was shattered, and healing seemed distant. The stage was set for a final chapter, one that would reveal whether Maplewood Estates could mend its wounds, or if the fence fiasco would leave a permanent scar on the community as history. As winter blanketed Maplewood Estates in a cold, quiet hush, the storm of the fence fiasco began to settle, though the neighborhood it left behind was forever changed. Months of heated confrontations, petty revenge, and broken trust had scarred the community, and the aftermath of the dispute stretched far beyond the physical barrier that had started it all. In the weeks following the final legal rulings, the fence still stood an unyielding monument to Claire Hastings' determination and the fractious battle she had waged. Despite court orders and mounting fines, Claire's fence remained. Though the victory was bittersweet, the war she had fought was not just about a fence. It was a clash of values, authority, and the delicate balance between personal freedom and communal order. Maplewood Estates, once the picture-perfect neighborhood, was now a study in social fracture. Friendships that had lasted years were broken beyond repair. Trust had dissolved like snow melting under an unforgiving sun. Block parties were a distant memory, and neighbors who once greeted each other by name now passed silently. Eyes fixed straight ahead, the HOA itself was shaken. The conflict had revealed fault lines within its leadership and governance. Margaret Wilkins, once the unchallenged queen of the neighborhood, faced mounting criticism for her rigid, uncompromising approach to calls for reform echoed through community meetings, with new candidates emerging who promised a more balanced, transparent leadership. The board was forced to reconsider its policies, recognizing that enforcing rules without empathy and flexibility could erode the very community it sought to protect. The financial toll of the dispute was significant. Legal fees, fines, and repair costs had drained resources from both Claire and the HOA. Resources that might otherwise have been invested in neighborhood improvements or community events. Some residents, weary of the ongoing drama, chose to sell their homes, unwilling to remain in a place marked by division. Yet amid the wreckage, there were signs of hope. A small but growing movement within Maplewood Estates began advocating for healing and reconciliation. Community leaders organized forums and workshops focused on communication, conflict resolution, and rebuilding neighborly bonds. Slowly, spaces for dialogue reopened, allowing residents to share their experiences and frustrations without fear of judgment or retaliation. Claire herself, though exhausted by the ordeal, became a reluctant symbol of resilience and activism. She worked with local advocacy groups to promote homeowner rights and encourage fair HOA practices. Her story was shared far beyond Maplewood Estates, inspiring discussions about the often unseen power dynamics within homeowners associations and the importance of balancing regulation with respect for individuality. The fence, once a source of division, gradually became a landmark of cautionary history. While it physically blocked the backyard, it also symbolized the walls people build between neighbors, within communities, and inside themselves when fear and suspicion take root. The neighborhood learned that rules matter, but so does humanity. That structure and order are essential, but so are flexibility and understanding. In the end, the fence fiasco served as a painful but invaluable lesson. It revealed how a single, seemingly small action can ripple outward, exposing underlying tensions and forcing a community to confront its values. It showed how power, when wielded without compassion, can divide rather than unite, and it underscored the necessity of open communication and mutual respect in any shared living space. Maplewood Estates would never be quite the same, but with time and effort, it began to heal. New traditions emerged, built on the hard-earned wisdom of the past. Neighbors cautiously extended hands, offering tentative peace and a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The fence fiasco that once tore the neighborhood apart had left behind a story of conflict, but also of courage, change, and the enduring hope that even the deepest wounds can heal.